Hey there. I wanted to record a quick optional video to attempt to give you a sense, if you are not familiar or if you feel like you need a quick refresher, of how to write the dreaded DBQ. You might have already taken AP US history. You might feel entirely confident with this format already. In which case, I'm not here to mess with what your previous teachers have done. You don't need to follow my suggestions. There's many different ways to do this particular task. But if you are unsure about how to do this task, if you've never written a DBQ before, if this is your first AP history course, or if you've done this before but you just want to know how I'm going to grade it for the context of my AP World History class, I'll give you a few suggestions and a few pieces of information in this video that might be very helpful for figuring out how to do this to my personal satisfaction, which obviously is the most important thing in your whole entire life. So, first things first, what is a DBQ? If you want to start really at the ground floor, it stands for a document-based question. And I'm going to highlight two important pieces of the name. The first important piece is the document-based part. You're going to get a question. You're going to get a prompt to address. You're going to get 7 primary sources. Sometimes you'll have a secondary source thrown in there. Most of them will be textual. Sometimes there will be a map or a political cartoon or a picture of a box for some reason. But you will get 7 sources, and you have to use them to answer the question. So the first thing that you need to know is that it really, really, really is important that you engage with those documents, that you analyze those documents, that you think critically about those documents instead of just accepting them at face value, that you cite those documents, that you tell your reader which document you're using by putting a nice little document 2 in parentheses when you're writing. It is a question that you have to answer based on the documents they provide you. The other thing that people very frequently forget, though, is they get really mired in the documents and they forget to look at the question. And that's the other thing that the DBQ does. That's what makes it different from a reading comprehension exercise. That's what makes it different from an exercise in just summarizing some documents, is that you have to start by looking at the prompt, and you have to formulate an argument in response to the prompt using your brain. So you can't just draw on the documents. A person with no knowledge of history, but really excellent reading comprehension, is highly unlikely to do well on this exercise. You have to use your prior knowledge and you have to use your historical thinking skills. That's the point of the DBQ. It's like a tiny little simulated exercise in what real live grown-up historians do all day, every day. So, I'm sure that for many of you, an important question on your brain is, how is this thing graded? I guess I can't get around addressing that. And even if you're not super concerned with the numerical score that results, I'm going to walk you through the College Board's rubric for the AP World History DBQ, so that you can know what tasks you are expected to perform in writing this essay. First thing they look for, first thing I'm trying to underline when I grade your DBQ, is a thesis statement. You have to answer the prompt. You have to make an historically defensible claim. It can't be totally off the wall. And you have to establish a line of reasoning, meaning you can't just say, yes, no, there was a really big effect. You have to give your reader in your thesis statement some hint at what is going to happen next. Very crucially, this is the only thing that the College Board says has to be in a particular place in your essay. Very specifically, your thesis statement must be 1 or more sentences all in a row. They have to be contiguous. They can't be scattered about the paragraph, and they have to be located in the first or last paragraph of your essay. They will not give you thesis credit, even if you have the world's most beautiful thesis statement in your second body paragraph. And for my purposes, I am going to tell you 100% of the time to make your thesis statement at the end of your introductory paragraph. If you happen to have time to write a conclusion paragraph, and if you happen to write a better thesis in your conclusion paragraph than you did in your intro, you can get credit for that, but don't count on it. It's very common on a timed test to run out of time to write your conclusion paragraph, and that's okay as long as you got a good thesis at the end of your introduction paragraph. Without a thesis, really hard to write a solid DBQ. Second thing we look for, and the other thing that's right up at the top of the essay, is something called contextualization, meaning that you need to describe a broader historical context relevant to the prompt. In other words, you want to establish for your reader, why is this prompt even happening, and what's the historical development that's being hinted at by the prompt. There's a bunch of different ways to do this. We'll address it more specifically in class later. The way that I prefer to teach it, and probably will not be able to do this here for copyright reasons, is that if you've ever watched the classic sitcom, The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, the introductory song in which Will Smith sits down in a spinning chair for some reason and explains how he was born and raised in West Philadelphia, and then he got in trouble, so his mom sent him to live with his aunt and uncle in Bel-Air, and you can see him walking into this fancy house with a butler greeting him at the door after getting out of the cab with a dice hanging on the mirror. That's contextualization. That basic backstory explains every single piece of hijinks that Will Smith goes through living in this very fancy California neighborhood that I actually have no idea where it is. That's what contextualization is. Give us the backstory, explain the developments behind the prompt, give us some sense of why this prompt is an interesting question to ask in the first place. And when you're writing that, that should go in your introductory paragraph, I would say before your thesis statement. Third thing you need to do is use evidence from the documents. And for full credit on this exam, you need to use evidence from at least 6 of the 7 documents that are provided for you to support an argument in response to the prompt. The most important words, and this is all language taken directly from the AP World History rubrics, the most important language is support an argument. You can't just tell me something that it says in document 1. You actually have to explain why it is that that thing in document 1 supports some claim that you are making. Again, a common pitfall in writing this essay is for people to get too hung up in the documents and just summarize each document point by point in numerical order. Your job is actually to use the documents to support the claims that you're making in response to the prompt. And that's where that phrase support an argument comes in. There is kind of a backup point where if you say something kind of coherent and accurate about at least the content of at least 3 of the documents, you can get half points in this category. That's why it's worth 2 points instead of 1. But you really want to focus on using those documents to back up your argument. You're in charge of the essay, not the documents. In addition to that, as a test of whether you have actually learned about the subject, retained some information, you need to use at least one additional piece of specific historical evidence to support your argument that cannot be found in the documents. And this is where you want to start thinking about the prompt even before you touch the documents, so that you can start generating lists of contextualization and generating ideas for that outside evidence, that piece of evidence beyond the documents. So use your key terms. If you remember specific people, events, ideas, etc., this is where that stuff comes in handy. If it's not covered in the documents, it's fair game for that evidence beyond the documents point. Thing number 5 that they look for is the dreaded sourcing. For at least 3 of the documents, you not only need to support an argument in response to the prompt, you also need to go beyond, we've been talking about this in class a lot, and explain how or why the document's purpose, point of view, historical situation, and or audience is relevant to your argument. So 2 things to highlight there. Number 1, this means that you need to be reading those documents with that critical lens. Your job is not just to summarize them, it is to think about them the way an historian would. Number 2, you can't just kind of shove these on there like a Post-it note and say, by the way, this author in document 3 is attempting to address the king of Zanzibar. You have to actually explain why that analysis supports your argument, right? Maybe what's interesting about this document is not actually what the author says, but how the author is very clearly trying to suck up to his boss, the head of the Ilkhanid court in Persia, and that shows us something about the way that the Mongols ran the fragments of their empire after Genghis Khan's death. So your job is to use sourcing in a way that supports your argument and is not just shoved in there because you know that it's on the rubric. Last thing, and some AP World teachers like to refer to this as the unicorn point because it's really difficult to teach and it's really difficult to get on the exam, is a point awarded for complexity. I am going to disappoint the overachievers among you by promising here and now to not spend really any time addressing how you can get complexity when you are writing this timed DBQ. Not because it's not important, just because it's really, really much harder to game than any other item on this rubric. And the grading criteria are fairly subjective. The essential criterion for grading this one is, well, you'll know it when you see it. But generally, what graders are looking for when they're trying to decide whether to award that complexity point is whether you made the pieces of evidence talk to one another. Did you advance an argument that was really just, well, the Mongol occupation, the Mongol conquest had three effects? Or are you being a little bit more subtle, a little bit more analytical? Are you admitting ways in which the evidence doesn't all line up to support the same points? Are you accepting that your argument might be true in some situations, but not in this one other situation? And here's why. Are you making meaningful comparisons at the end of your essay to some other historical development that wasn't explicitly asked about in the prompt? I've seen all of those things get complexity points, but it's really, really hard to game. It's quite common that if you're getting the other 6 points, and if you know what you're doing, you will get that 7th point. But I don't actually want you to focus too much on achieving the complexity point in and of itself, because you can have a perfectly respectable AP exam score up to and including a 5 without getting it. It's nice, it's not going to be necessary, it's the icing on the cake. What does this essay look like? You're going to be disappointed by the uninteresting nature of this response. It's going to be quite similar to your standard 5-paragraph essay. Presumably, if you've had any formal schooling whatsoever, this has been banged into your head already. Your first paragraph is going to be an introductory paragraph, and you can earn 2 of your 7 points in that introductory paragraph. You want to start with contextualization. That should be a few sentences, not just one sentence, giving background information that is relevant to the prompt, explaining the historical developments that are referenced in the prompt. You want to end your introductory paragraph with a thesis statement, which could be 1 or 2 sentences that respond to the prompt and that establish a line of reasoning. So again, not just stating yes, no to a great extent to the prompt, but actually previewing for your reader what your claims might be. Paragraphs 2, 3, and 4, and I'm generally going to counsel you to write 3 body paragraphs, although for some prompts it might be okay to do 2, but generally I'm going to say 3. Paragraphs 2, 3, and 4 are your body paragraphs. This should sound really, really familiar, and we've done a few of these in class already. You will start with a topic sentence. Please be sure not to jump directly into the analysis of a specific document in your topic sentence. It's really important that you establish a claim that's going to cover multiple documents. In that topic sentence, you want to make a claim that's smaller than the thesis, but that's bigger than any individual document. So you're establishing how you have decided to group your documents together with that topic sentence, and you want to make sure that it can be tied back to your thesis statement. You're going to, in each body paragraph, present evidence to support your claim, and remember that that evidence comes both from the documents and from your own outside knowledge. And you're going to have to do this, very important, I yell at you about it all the time, without directly quoting. There's no rule against it from the College Board's perspective, but I routinely tell my students not to do it because it's really, really easy to quote a document and then think incorrectly that you've analyzed it, when actually what you've just done is copy paste the author's words, and that's not going to do you any good. It doesn't necessarily demonstrate to me as your reader that you have understood what's going on here. When you integrate sourcing, again, it has to be in a way that supports your argument. Let the thesis and the claims guide the structure of your essay. And so when you are mentioning point of view or purpose or intended audience or historical situation, you need to be able to tie that analysis back to the claim in the topic sentence and to the thesis as well. If you can write a conclusion paragraph, that's generally good advice. If you are writing a DBQ in a timed testing situation, for those of you who are going to take the full-length AP exam in the spring, they'll recommend 60 minutes to write the DBQ, and they'll recommend 15 minutes to read the documents and outline, and then 45 to write. That's not a hard and fast limit, but I think it's a really good guideline if you want to leave yourself time to do the other part of that exam, which we'll talk about later. But when you are under that time limit, you might or might not have time to write a conclusion. I think you should if you can. I don't think it should be your highest priority. If you have time to write a conclusion, though, you should restate your thesis. You should do it in different words. You shouldn't literally copy what you put at the first paragraph. And the reason for that is that often as you are writing through, you start to get your head around what your argument is a little bit more clearly than you did when you wrote your introductory paragraph. And so often, if people have time to write a conclusion, often the statement of their thesis is actually clearer and better and more compelling in the conclusion than it is in the introduction. So do it in different words, because it's quite possible that if your intro thesis was not quite up to par, that your conclusion thesis will actually earn that thesis point. And then, in pursuit of the elusive complexity point, you want to take some time at the conclusion to consider the implications of your argument. How does this compare to a different historical development that wasn't directly addressed in the prompt? What might be, if I zoomed out a little bit in space or in time or in a theme, what might be some other implications or some others, what might be different about my argument if I had applied it to a different field? In other words, what are the questions that were raised in this essay that I didn't actually have time to address because it wasn't directly what the prompt is about? This is the time to show off that you are an interesting person with interesting thoughts beyond what you were asked to do in a testing situation. But in a testing situation, not your highest priority. So that's the general outline. And I've got some exemplars linked on my unit schedule. I am happy to provide some more if you want to see how this works in practice. Quick word about dealing with the prompt. Generally speaking, on the AP exam, on AP aligned assessments, your prompt is going to follow this form, is going to start with the words, evaluate the extent to which blah, 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 blah. Here are a couple of examples. I might ask you to evaluate the extent to which indigenous peoples' reactions to state expansion differed in the period 1750 to 1900. I might ask you to evaluate the extent to which the experience of the First World War changed relationships between Europeans and colonized peoples. I might ask you to evaluate the extent to which the Mongol conquest led to economic and social change in Afro-Eurasia. But that common thread is generally going to be beginning with the phrase, evaluate the extent to which. Just a couple of tips. Evaluate the extent to which is kind of a tricky, sneaky, underhanded way to begin an essay prompt because they don't actually generally want you to literally say, well, how far did it go? And that becomes nonsensical when we're talking about a non-quantitative question, right? The Mongol conquest led to some extent of economic and social change in Afro-Eurasia is kind of meaningless. So I would actually counsel you to avoid using the word extent in your answer. That's counterintuitive because it makes it seem like you're responding less directly to the prompts. But in general, strong thesis statements don't attempt to make any kind of quantitative evaluation of the extent to which. Similarly, you want to include those keywords from the prompt. If I'm looking at that first prompt, I probably want to say something about indigenous peoples. I probably want to say something about state expansion. I might want to name check that period of 1750 to 1900. But I don't want to just rephrase it. I don't want to turn it into a slightly different sentence because one way that people often think they've written a thesis but have not is to say, indigenous peoples' reactions differed significantly to state expansion, or indigenous peoples' reactions to state expansion differed to a moderate extent. That doesn't actually add any value to the prompt. Your job is to establish a line of reasoning to tell your reader not just what you're going to argue, but a little bit about how you're going to argue it in your essay. And in order to do that, you need to go beyond saying, well, to some extent. So if you can't just say how much, what do you do? My suggestion would be to think about the three historical reasoning processes. We've talked about this a little bit before. They are causation, so causes and effects, comparison, similarities and differences, or continuity and change over time. What changed, what stayed the same, considering this particular turning point. If you read these prompts carefully, you can kind of see that each of them is hinting at one of those historical reasoning processes. So if I look at that first one, that word differed should clue me in that I'm probably going to make an argument about comparison. If I look at that second sample prompt, I'm probably going to be writing an essay about continuity and change over time. Right? I'm going to think about what's the same in those relationships between Europeans and colonized peoples before and after World War I. What is different after World War I? With those second and third prompts, I might also be making an argument about causation. Why did the Mongol conquest lead to economic and social change? Or what were the effects of the Mongol conquests? There's not always going to be a very clear one-to-one relationship between prompt and historical reasoning process, but often the prompt will provide you with a clue. That's a good framework for just thinking about whether you're actually making an argument, you're actually adding value to the prompt, as opposed to just kind of restating it without saying anything significantly new. One last tip. Pay attention to the piece's theme words. when they appear in the prompt. So if I'm looking at that third one, I really need to pay attention to the terms economic and social. That means I might have a really, really strong set of ideas about the extent to which Mongol conquests cause diffusion of religion and this new form of religious tolerance throughout the Mongol Empire. I might have all these things ready to say about how the Confucians are unseated in China, and this new era of tolerance for Buddhism flourishes under the Yuan dynasty. But it's not relevant to the prompt because that's the theme of culture. And the prompt is asking me about themes of economics and social organization. So you want to be really, really careful to highlight those terms when you see them in the prompt and make sure that your evidence is responsive to the themes that they have asked you about and not the other themes that may have occurred to you. Finally, I'm going to offer you a brief process. I'm not going to give you a step-by-step. I think your writing processes will differ depending on your previous experience and the way your brain works and the way you like to do this. But I'm just going to offer you a couple of suggestions about what you might want to do at key stages of writing this essay, especially in a timed situation. Number one, spend some good time on the question. Really common mistake to dive right into the documents, which is understandable because you're often going to be anxious about being able to read all those words in a short period of time. But really do pause and read the question first because it's going to give you a lot of clues about what to pay attention to and what to ignore. When you read that question, you might want to draft a thesis statement. I wouldn't recommend in a time testing situation taking the time to actually write the whole sentence out. But if I get that prompt about effects of the Mongol conquests on economic and social organization, I might just write down a couple of bullet points about things that I already am thinking about when I read that prompt before touching the document, right? I might think about increased trade. I might think about displacing old elites. And I might just jot down those bullet points as they occur to me. Similarly, you want to just write down some background knowledge. Again, just quick notes for yourself. Don't write a whole paragraph at this point. But if I happen to know the Mongols are pastoral nomadic people, their homeland's in Mongolia, but they build the largest land empire ever. They are unusually religiously tolerant. They're interested in spreading scientific innovations, et cetera, et cetera. I'm going to write all those things down just in very quick bullet point format because that's going to help me understand the documents. And that's also going to help me write my intro paragraph and get that contextualization point. Second thing, when you have spent a little bit of time thinking about the question and thinking about what you might write about even before touching the documents, then you want to skim the documents. And this is not the time to do a detailed close read. This is not the time to get distracted by defining a word that you don't know but that is not essential to the meaning of the document. Faster is better here, if at all possible. As you're reading, make quick notes on the side if it's very obvious that, say, an author's point of view is clearly influenced by their religious background or something like that. But don't make a point of doing all four types of sourcing. You just have to do one type of sourcing for at least three documents in order to earn full credit for that category. So make notes as it becomes obvious. Don't try and do it for every single document. You just don't have time yet. Second thing I would recommend is grouping the documents. And you're almost always going to write a 3-paragraph DBQ or 3-body paragraph DBQ, meaning that you want to be able to divide those documents into 3 groups. So I would just, again, don't spend a huge amount of time writing a bunch of words at this point. But as you're reading, if you notice that documents 1, 3, and 4 all seem to address an economic consequence, whereas documents 2 and 5 all seem to address a social consequence, then you might want to start making note of just what they have in common. There's always going to be a bunch of different ways to do this right for any given DBQ and set of 7 documents. So don't freak out if it doesn't seem immediately obvious to you, or if it seems like there's a couple different good ways of grouping. Just figure out a way that you can do this because that's the way that you're going to end up outlining your DBQ. Speaking of which, I think you should make an outline, but I really think it should be pretty skeletal because, again, in a timed testing situation, you're not going to have time to draft every individual topic sentence and then tinker with it as you write the final version. You do, however, the purpose of outlining is primarily to make sure that you have covered all of your bases in terms of making sure that you meet the criteria set out in the rubric. And so I'm going to recommend a few hard and fast rules for that very skeletal outline. One, you should always try to use all 7 documents. If you try to use all 7 and you swing and you miss on one of them, that's fine. You've used 6 to support the argument in response to the prompt. You can still get full points. If you only try to use 6 documents and you swing and miss at one of them, then all of a sudden you've lost one of the very few points available in this DBQ. So always try to use all 7, always plan to use all 7, always get all 7 of them into those groups. Second, you should plan to analyze sourcing for at least 4 documents by the same theory. And when you're outlining, this is where you also want to think about whether your analysis of an author's purpose or their intended audience or point of view or historical situation might help your argument as you're writing that DBQ. Finally, for exactly the same reasons, you want to plan to use at least 2 pieces of outside evidence. And when you're jotting down a quick outline, make a note of any key terms, any people, any events, any concepts that are not covered in the documents that you can still use to try and answer the question, to try and support your argument. Put some outside evidence in there. And again, if you try with one and you fail, you have a backup plan, and that's a good way to maximize your score. We're going to practice this in class. I'm very available. If you want help, if you want me to look at drafts, the earlier you ask me, the less cranky I will be about it. So please don't hesitate to reach out if you have questions about this. There's also plenty of other resources that are available in your unit schedule. If you want to listen to somebody other than me and possibly with a better beard and higher production values, explain how to do this same task. But please, please, please ask for help if you need it.